Hey everybody. This video is on the life and martyrdom of Saint Cyprian of Carthage, who I think is the greatest churchman of the 3rd century. As with our previous videos on Saints Polycarp and Justin Martyr, I'm going to take a few minutes just to tell you about Saint Cyprian the man before we focus in on the account of his martyrdom, because I think it's helpful to have an idea of just who it is. Who is this Cyprian who's making this heroic stand for the faith? Because, in a sense, the martyr's testimony to Jesus Christ doesn't begin at his arrest. It begins at his baptism and embraces his entire life, not just his final moments. For some of the martyrs, like Blandina in our last video, we don't know what their life was like before they stepped onto the stage for their final struggle. But in the case of Cyprian, we actually know an awful lot. Cyprian was born in the early 3rd century AD, probably not long after the year 200, to a noble pagan family in North Africa. He was raised with all the benefits of his wealth and status, and given a first-class education, which he really took to like a fish to water. So Cyprian is one of the several Latin fathers of the Church who were also fluent in Greek, which he used to good effect in some of his letters, meaning that he could write letters not just to people in the Western Roman Empire where they spoke Latin, but he could also write letters to bishops from the East, which he does on several occasions. He achieved prominence even as a young man as a virtuoso orator, because in antiquity, as is still the case today, words are power. And if you were a good enough speaker, the world was at your feet, meaning he could argue in court, speak in the local assembly, speak in the public square, speak among friends to charm and entertain, and he quickly established himself as one of the leading men of the city. And Carthage of the time was one of the leading cities of the empire. I'd say it was probably rivaled only by Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome itself. But all was not well with young Cyprian. He was a fairly serious young man, and he tried his best to live virtuously and to do what was right, according to his lights. But struggle though he might, he could never seem to get the upper hand on sin. He wasn't happy. And it was at this point that he met a man who was to change his life forever, a Catholic priest by the name of Caecilianus. Cyprian began visiting the older man, first as a source of information, then as an esteemed friend, until eventually Cyprian moved into his house and became practically a son to him. We know that Caecilianus looked on Cyprian as a son because when he died, he asked Cyprian to look after his wife and children, as though he were the new head of the family. Cyprian was soon baptized and then was ordained a deacon and then a priest. Because in Christianity, finally, he had found what he was looking for, and his conscience was clear, and he was at peace. There's this marvelous passage in one of his writings where he talks about his conversion, which I'd like to read to you. I was bound fast, held by so many errors of my past life, from which I did not believe I could escape. So I was disposed to give in to my clinging vices. I despaired of living better, and indulged my sins as if they were part of me. But afterwards, when the stain of my past life had been washed away by the waters of rebirth, a light from above poured itself upon my chastened and now pure heart. Then through the Spirit which is breathed from heaven, a second birth made me a new man. And then, miraculously, immediately, the doubtful cleared, the closed opened, the darkness lit up. Where before I found difficulty, I saw a way forward. What before I thought impossible was able to be done. I had to acknowledge that what was of the earth and born of the flesh, and had lived submissive to sins, had now begun to be of God, for the Holy Spirit had given it life. That is a remarkable testimony from a remarkable man. But remember that the transformative grace of God that Cyprian discovered all those years ago is still at work in the church today, if we but lay hold of it. Very shortly after his conversion and baptism, Cyprian was ordained a deacon and then a priest. Cyprian had inherited great wealth and property, and very shortly after his conversion and baptism, he sold it and gave all the money to the poor, and he never married. So when the bishop of Carthage died, Cyprian was elected his successor by popular acclaim, but Cyprian refused. He was then only in his 40s, probably, at the oldest, and he had been a Christian just a few short years. But the people were adamant, so Cyprian went into hiding. But the people found out where he was hiding, and they surrounded the house and refused to let him leave until he agreed to become bishop. So Cyprian was consecrated Bishop of Carthage. The year was 248. He immediately set to work, enacting reforms, urging the faithful to live simply, give alms to the poor. But almost overnight, persecution broke out. The Roman Emperor Decius published a decree that all residents of the empire should offer sacrifice to the gods on penalty of death. Up to this point, the persecutions had all been local. So a flare-up in Smyrna, another in Lyon, right? But those affected only the Christians of that region. The Decian persecution was the first empire-wide campaign to stamp out the Christian faith, and in the end would prove to be one of the most awful bloodlettings in the history of the church. So Cyprian had a decision to make. Either stay where he was and face certain death, or flee the city and do what he could for the church from abroad. Cyprian decided to flee, and it must have been one of the most difficult decisions of his life. He would be accused of cowardice for the remainder of his episcopal reign, but in my view, it was the right choice. In Rome, the Pope didn't have a chance to escape, and so the church there was without a bishop when they needed one the most. It was 14 months before they elected a successor. As for Carthage, Cyprian did an amazing job of leading his church, although he had to do it remotely. You can still read some of his letters from that period today, and you can just tell how much it breaks his heart not to be able to see his people face to face. When the persecution ended, Cyprian returned to the city to find a church in ruins. Books had been burnt, buildings destroyed, and a multitude of lukewarm Christians had denied the faith to save their lives and were now asking to be let back in. Cyprian did the best he could to hold the church together, and they tried to rebuild. During this time, he worked feverishly. He held synods. He sent letters to Spain, to Italy, to Cappadocia, of course to other parts of Africa. And he composed a number of treatises, short theological essays, which continue to nourish the church to this day. I want to pause for a minute and say a little something about Cyprian's works. Now, here is a translation of Cyprian's Letters in 4 volumes, 1,383 pages of them. These are only the letters that have come down to us. Actually, I'm pulling your leg. There are only 82 letters from Cyprian's letter collection that have survived to today, and they actually take up only about 300 pages of this, so less than a quarter. The rest is notes and introduction and commentary, which raises the question, why lavish so much attention on Cyprian? Why are his letters so special? The reason is that Cyprian lived and wrote in something of a historical donut hole. There are a few years in what's called the crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire that are not covered by any of the reliable ancient historians. And that happens to be precisely the time period when Cyprian was writing these letters. So basically, if we didn't have Cyprian, we would know next to nothing about the Roman Empire in his time period, making his writings hugely important, not just to theologians, but also to classicists and historians. There are also 13 of Cyprian's treatises that have come down to us. Actually, there are only 12 in here, which is a little disappointing. But if you want to read Cyprian, this is where I would start, because there's some great stuff in these treatises. Incidentally, we don't know how many treatises Cyprian wrote in all, So St. Jerome wrote this book called On Illustrious Men, De Viris Illustribus, which is, I would say, the closest thing that we get in antiquity to like a library catalog of the early church. So St. Jerome goes through all of the great men of Christian history, starting with the apostles. And when he comes upon a writer, he gives a list of the man's works, at least all that he knows about, which tends to be most of them. Well, in Jerome's entry on Cyprian, he says, and I quote, "It would be superfluous to make a catalogue of the works of his genius, since they are more obvious than the sun." I like that. The two treatises of Cyprian that I think deserve special mention are first, De Unitate, on the unity of the Church, which is actually one of the things our founder David gave to me to read before I became Catholic. And it's an argument and an exhortation for unity in the Church, since to be united and in one accord is an inseparable part of what it is to be Christian. And second, Cyprian's treatise on the Lord's Prayer, which is a great classic. And about 100 years after he wrote this, the great Gallic theologian St. Hilary of Poitiers sat down to write a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. Actually, we've got it here. And when Hilary gets to the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, he just skips over it. And he says, "Know what? I'm not even going to try. If you want a commentary on the Lord's Prayer, go read Cyprian. There's no way I'm going to top this." I'm going to put links to both these treatises down below, so make sure you check out the show notes. So, after a few short years, persecution again broke out in AD 257, this time under the Emperor Valerian. And this time, Cyprian got caught. So we turn now to the acts of his martyrdom. And as with St. Justin Martyr, we have the official case notes from Cyprian's trial, so we can see exactly what happened, and word for word what was said. Now, unlike Justin, Cyprian was from the upper classes, and so even though he was a Christian, he gets treated much differently than all the others we've been studying. So the acts fall into three parts. The first part is his initial arrest, and this is in 257 at the very start of the persecution. On August 30th at Carthage, in his private room, Paternus the proconsul said to Cyprian the bishop, "The most sacred emperors Valerian and Gallienus have thought fit to send me a letter in which they have commanded that those who do not observe the Roman religion must recognize the Roman rites. I have therefore made inquiries concerning yourself. What answer have you to give me?" Cyprian the bishop said, "I am a Christian and a bishop. I know no other God but the one true God, who made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them. This God we Christians serve. To him we pray day and night, for ourselves, for all men, and for the safety of the emperors themselves." Proconsul Paternus said, "Is your will constant in this?" Bishop Cyprian answered, "A good will, which knows God, cannot be altered." Proconsul Paternus said, "Can you then, in accordance with the order of Valerius and Gallienus, go into exile in the city of Carubus?" Bishop Cyprian said, "I will go." After this, the proconsul asks Cyprian for a list of his priests. And Cyprian, who of course has legal training, points out that there's a law against what's called delation, or informing on people. And, according to Christian discipline, we aren't allowed to turn ourselves in for persecution. So, regrettably, I can't ask them to volunteer themselves. It's kind of a funny exchange, and it's interesting. There's not even the hint that the proconsul would consider using torture to get the information out of Cyprian. Because again, the rules are different when you have noble blood. The second part of the Acts takes place 1 year later. Cyprian is recalled from exile. The emperor had issued a sterner decree, according to which all Christian bishops, priests, and deacons were to be put to death. And they load him in a wagon and bring him to the proconsul, who this year was a man named Galerius Maximus. But the proconsul was ill, so he gave orders that the trial was to be held the next day, September 14th, 258. So Cyprian stayed the night at one of the high officials' houses, and the next morning was led into court. And there's a funny anecdote that's been preserved in a short book by Cyprian's personal secretary, the deacon Pontius, who may also be the one who put together and distributed the acts of his martyrdom. So according to Pontius, on the morning of the trial, one of the officers in Cyprian's escort, who was a former Christian, offered him a change of clothes, to which Cyprian replied, "That would be to solve a problem that will no longer exist after today." A huge crowd gathered outside to watch Cyprian as he was led before the proconsul. When he had been brought before him, Galerius Maximus the proconsul said to Cyprian the bishop, "Are you Thascius Cyprian?" Bishop Cyprian answered, "I am." Proconsul Galerius Maximus said, "The most sacred emperors have commanded you to perform the rite." Bishop Cyprian answered, "I will not." Proconsul Galerius Maximus said, "Consider carefully." Bishop Cyprian answered, "Do as you are bid. In so clear a case, there is no need for deliberation." I can't tell you how impressed I was by Cyprian the first time I read this. This guy is made of steel. He is not a coward. So the proconsul retires to consider the case, and when he returns, he gives this speech. Galerius Maximus, with difficulty and reluctance, spoke as follows: "You have long persisted in your sacrilegious views, and have joined to yourself many other vicious men in a conspiracy. You have set yourself up as an enemy of the gods of Rome and our religious practices, nor have the pious and most sacred emperors Valerian and Gallienus, the Augusti, and Valerian, the most noble Caesar, been able to recall you to the observance of their rites. Therefore, since you have been convicted as the instigator and standard-bearer in a most atrocious crime, you shall be an example to those whom in your wickedness you have gathered to yourself. Discipline shall be vindicated in your blood." With these words he read from the tablet the sentence: "Thascius Cyprian shall die by the sword." Bishop Cyprian said, "Thanks be to God." Wow. There goes a man. Cyprian's response to his sentencing has become famous and will be familiar to any of you who routinely assist at a Latin Mass. "Deo gratias." Those were his exact words. After this, he was led out that very day to his execution, which is the third part of the Acts of Cyprian. His execution was to take place in a little valley in the woods, and the crowd followed along, and there were people climbing the trees so that they could see what was happening. Cyprian took off his cloak and spread it on the ground to kneel on, and he gave his dalmatic to some of his deacons. The people began spreading cloths and napkins on the ground to catch some of his blood, and Cyprian stood there, calmly, and awaited his executioner. When he arrived, Cyprian told his friends to give the man 25 pieces of gold, and Cyprian went to tie a handkerchief around his eyes, but he couldn't get it tied, so one of his priests and a subdeacon tied it for him. And then he knelt down, and Cyprian was beheaded. When evening came, the Christians came down and gathered up his body and bore it through the streets in a torchlight procession to the cemetery where he was buried. And that is the end of the Acts of Cyprian. Let us pray for our priests and bishops that they be given the grace not only to live like Cyprian did, but, if we're called upon, to die like him. May it be so for all of us. Thanks for watching.